Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing awesome. Welcome to another episode of Productized Me Radio. I'm here today. I'm super excited about this episode with my good friend Thomas Deschutter from Bloom Strategies. He's the CEO of Bloom Strategies and the author of Bloom Your Money, Bloom Your Life. He's a former musician and a drummer, which I'm really excited to talk about as well, because I'm sure there are a lot of good lessons that he has pulled from that into what he does in his professional life now. And one of the biggest reasons that I brought Thomas on the show for the sake of our audience here is because Thomas is very familiar with and an advocate of the profit first financial strategy for businesses. If you don't know what that is, you will after this episode. We're going to dive into some things specifically that entrepreneurs can do to implement that and different things that they should take into account when they're managing their own finances. So Thomas, did I do a good job, man? Can you add to the intro or fill in any gaps?
Well, I'm a happily married man of almost 20 years now, and I have two amazing teenage twin daughters that just started high school. And I'd say that was great, Tommy. And a lot of what I do is my family fuels what I do. Like that connection for me is the deepest connection I have, other than the connection I have with my internal self. And so, though, myself and my family, those things combined are what really drive me going forward.
Awesome. That's actually really awesome, and I want to talk about that a little bit more as well, because your whole philosophy with how you guide and consult with your clients on finances is really sort of fascinating. So yeah, that might actually be cool to dive into as well before we get into some of this other stuff. So I know when I talked with you about finances and did a quick consultation a little while ago, you don't start by talking about money. You start by talking about other things. So can you just talk about your philosophy a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for me, values is everything. Like what people value ultimately, how they think, what they focus on mentally is ultimately going to drive their true reality. They can say all the stuff they want about what they'd like to have, but if that's not actually in your consciousness, if that's not what you're really ruminating on, it's really difficult to have that show up. And I'll give you an example. When I was a musician, when I was playing, when I was really hungry to be a successful recording artist, everything I did revolved around the band. When are we rehearsing? What kind of gear? I knew all the greatest gear in drumming. I went down to the music store all the time and tried out new stuff. We practiced 3 to 4 nights a week. We did gigs almost every weekend. We went on tours. We got into a recording studio. Like everything we did was about driving that forward. And the day, I remember my dad said to me, if you're, the moment you're not all pulling a rope in the same direction, you're going nowhere. And I remember one day I had this inkling, like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And in that moment, I knew my music career was over. That if I can no longer really drive myself forward on that idea, it's not going to happen. Like it's just not going to happen. And so what I found with money, especially as a stockbroker for almost 18 years and working with people's finances, that until I really know what's driving the boat, what is really going on internally, and what they really want and desire, anything I do is not really going to matter. It's just going to be fluff, if you will. And so I want to know what lights you up. Like, what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here, and push you to come up with that stuff. Cause then we're cooking with gas, as I like to say. At that point, now we've got fuel, right? We've got something that we're focused on that's going to get us somewhere.
So kind of segueing from there into some of the other stuff that we're going to talk about, like what are some of the things that you encounter with business owners and entrepreneurs when they talk about what lights them up that helps you kind of develop a financial strategy for them?
Well, I'd say in a lot of cases, entrepreneurs especially, they're out to cause a shift in the world. Like everything they're doing is they've recognized something that doesn't quite work, or that they're not really excited about, and they've seen that it can be different. So they already are thinking outside the box of the traditional sort of planning rules that we have in financial planning, right? They're a different breed in that they're out to cause something. And usually with those people, what I see is that they're stepping into something they don't know themselves to be. And so what I mean by that is it's really easy to sit on the sofa and watch football on Sunday, or here in Canada to watch ice hockey on Saturday night. That's easy to do. What's more difficult to do is to pull yourself away from that to do something that you're not sure is going to be successful. That you don't know how it's going to turn out. Like, we always think the future is going to be brighter for ourselves, but we don't know.
Yeah.
And so what I found is entrepreneurs are really driven by a bigger idea. And so when I work with entrepreneurs, what I find mostly is I'm blown away when I ask them value questions of what's important to them, or what do they want to see in the world, or what is a legacy they want to leave behind. They actually have those ideas in place. They know what those things look like, and that is their fuel. And so what I want to do is tap into that fuel with them. I want that to feed all of the financial decisions that we're going to make.
So how do you advise someone like that then, in terms of like the strategies that you tell them to kind of engage on to, like based on some of the things that they're engaged with in terms of like the different business ventures that they have, and they obviously have money going there? Are you like, okay, cool, keep allocating that there, we'll do this with this or whatever? You don't have to go too specific, kind of in general, like how do you set up a structure for them?
Yeah, good question. And it's really different for every person, obviously, because every situation is going to have different outcomes that they've already achieved. They're going to have different stress points. They're going to have different needs. So it is a tailoring thing. But here's what I'll say, and you touched on this off the top, is the profit first. So I used to just work mostly with families and individuals and some business owners on cash flow planning for their family finances. I read Profit First, and it blew my mind, actually, because it shifted the way I even looked at money as my own business owner. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I have my own business. I've been in business for myself since even when I was a musician. I was in business for myself. And what I found from that experience was the shift in mindset around driving profits in the business. And so it inspired me to actually become a profit first professional. So I'm a designated profit first professional. I joined their team. I can hang that out as my shingle. And now what I see with business owners, what we want to do, here's the typical thinking. And I know you asked a specific question about each person, but it's really different. So here's the main frame of where we want to start. Most businesses function under GAAP accounting, general accounting principles, right?
Yeah.
So that's the essence. And the idea around that is revenue minus expenses equals profit. Right? No, most people are used to that. That's the way all accountants work. That's so generally accepted accounting principles are revenue minus expenses equals profit. Well, profit first is revenue minus profit equals expenses, right? Let's drive the business to be profitable from day one. How can we do that? What's it going to take? And what it required for me when I did this, because part of being a profit first professional is you do it on your own business first. What I ended up doing was I cut thousands of dollars of expenses in my business that I didn't really, when I really looked at it, they were nice, but they weren't driving my bottom line. They weren't actually bringing me more clients. When I did the analysis, they were features and benefits that were nice that I had added onto the business that just kind of stayed there. It even got to the point where I gave up my office space, and I virtually have a virtual office now. In financial planning, having a virtual office is a scary thing because you want your clients to think they can come somewhere to see you. Well, most of where my clients meet me is right here.
Yeah.
We do a lot of video meetings and a lot of telephone call meetings. So that was one expense that I was able to really control and cut back on. And so, that's where profit first starts, is that we want to look at a business. We want to get the ideas of what do you want to accomplish? What's important to you? Then the analysis on the numbers starts. And it's the same with personal financial planning. And so every situation is different, but the key is the values drives the decision making.
Yeah, you said a lot of good stuff there. And before we get into some more of the specific questions that I have about some of those things that you just mentioned, because I do have a couple that I wrote down, could we talk a little bit more? Let's back up for a second and talk about profit first. You said profit, the general profit first model is revenue minus profit equals expenses. So I understand that framework. Can you outline a little bit more about like what profit first means, the theory, and kind of like how people set it up as a business?
Yeah. So I guess the best way to give that is to give an example, and I can say this for myself is that as you're driving your business, you have some revenue streams, and I've lived week to week, check to check. I've looked at the bank account every day to see if money came in. I've been in those moments, right? I've certainly had those as an entrepreneur, and so it's kind of scattered. You have all these ideas and things you want to accomplish, and maybe a big deal comes along, and you get the deal and the money shows up in the account, and before you know it, you spent it on all these things you think you need, and now you're back to square one of checking the bank account till the next big deal comes along, right? And it's kind of this hamster in a wheel sort of thing where you're running and you're running and you're running, you're bringing in revenue, you're spending the money, and at the end of it, maybe there's a profit left over. You're not really sure because you think you're doing all of these things to grow the business. So what we want to do is start to curve that. So it's not an immediate stop. It's not like I walk into a business and go, we're changing everything you do.
Yeah.
It's not that. It's a step-by-step process of recognizing and analyzing and making decisions based on the numbers that allow us to start moving forward. So I'll give you an example. My first quarter of adding profit first into my business, because I never did it before, was to actually take 2% of the real revenue and put it in a profit first account. Like that's it.
Yeah.
But what I got to was in my first quarter after that, I actually got to write myself a bonus. Like that's the first time in my own business where I actually allocated a profit bonus to myself. Not that I was never getting paid before, it's that I never had that mindset. And when that happened, it was a game changer. Suddenly I was like, hey, I liked that. I actually paid myself some money that I was able to go out with my family and do whatever I wanted with, because it was a bonus. It wasn't for my daily living expenses. It wasn't for, I think you know what I mean. It was just a different conversation that I had with myself. And it inspired me to then take on the next quarter, which we then moved up the profit allocation in the next quarter. And then we do it again in the next quarter until we achieve what we call our TAPS, our target asset allocation plan. Like what is the ultimate we're trying to get to for profit, for expenses, for owner's pay, for income of the business. Like we start to set targets for all those areas. And then as a business owner, that's what you focus on. You actually begin to focus on those numbers. And it's really easy to do your accounting. Now you're not looking at everything in the business. You're looking at how are those numbers being affected right now, and what are those percentages that I'm putting away.
Yeah, and you used a couple terms there, real revenue and TAPS. I know you just defined TAPS, so we can leave that one alone. But back to real revenue for a second, for anybody who doesn't know what that is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but real revenue essentially for like a service-based business would just be gross revenue minus cost of goods sold, or whatever it takes to fulfill the service directly, and then everything else considered a different operational expense, correct?
Yeah. And if you have subcontractors, they'd be in that deduction first too. So if if you have a bunch of practitioners out there that bring in revenue and you split it with them, you would take their portion off, right? That leaves the business. That's a subcontractor. And now what's left over is the real revenue. And that's where you want to operate from. You don't want to operate on the other expenses. You want to operate on, here's the real revenue. Now, how is my business functioning?
Yeah, and I think something that is often misunderstood in entrepreneurship when people talk about numbers, especially in my world, a lot of people talk about gross revenue, and I see a lot of more rookie entrepreneurs talking about that as well. And that number really, it doesn't mean anything, because gross revenue can be so different for so many different businesses depending on the margins associated with that. And when you really getting down to it, the real revenue is it's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing to really go off of, because it's the only amount of money that is left over. And as an entrepreneur starting out with an online service-based business or a productized service, for some of our listeners, it's really important that you make sure that you try to maximize the real revenue from the start. Like in an earlier episode with another financial business consultant that we did, he recommended to keep that margin at no less than 66%. Starting out, and the higher the better. What do you have any thoughts on that, or like a metric that you work with?
So maybe just make sure I understand the question. So is there a normal of what real revenue should be in relation to the total revenue coming in?
Yeah, like a percentage.
That's not a focus of profit first. What is a focus of profit first is when we have that real revenue number, we have set targets for expenses, set targets for owner's pay, set targets for taxes, set targets for profit.
Yeah,
Right? That's where so once we have that real revenue number, then we focus in on your actual operational expenses,
yeah,
your actual profit, your actual taxation, and yeah, that's so. And I'll give you like something you touched on there, Tommy, which was really interesting to me was that, having been a broker for as long as I have, and I gave up my license a few years ago, but spending so much time looking over publicly traded companies and price to earnings ratios. Let's just look at, for example, we're using Zoom today,
yeah,
right? So Zoom just went public a little while ago. Well, they lost money in their first quarter, right? It doesn't mean nobody got paid. It just means that they, at the end of the day, when the bookkeeping is all done on that business, they bled into all of the money that they've raised through selling parts of the business off,
yeah,
right? Like, so if you're an entrepreneur and you're not looking to sell any parts of your business, it's pretty hard to run at a negative all the time. You
yeah,
need to be generating positive cash flow at the bottom line in order for you to survive. Even if you write yourself down to zero, but your pay was included in there, you're still running a business that is at least feeding you.
yeah,
Right. And so what we want to do is build up that business to where it's not only feeding the owner, it's actually generating profits. It's looking after the people that work with that business. It's paying its taxes because taxes are just part of life. It's the way it is. So embrace it and make the best of it is always my theory around taxes, and build that business. Because then if you ever decide to sell it, I'll tell you, the best business to sell is one where somebody can see how much they're going to be getting.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's another thing too that I learned in the process of selling my business is the better my books were pretty good. They could have definitely been better, but I was happy that I at least dedicated a lot more effort apparently than most people do to keeping that clean and telling a story of like what my business was actually capable of doing. I have a question though, like with regard to because you talked about you brought up a cool point with Zoom. There's companies that lose money. They go negative months and quarters. And when you're doing profit first, the whole idea is to not go negative. And I think the author of the book, by the way, is called Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. Mike Michalowicz, for anyone that wants to look at that and reference sort of what we're talking about. But one thing that I think about is like, okay, let's say like I'm a bootstrap business owner, but I have like 20 or 30 grand to invest. And I kind of know a couple things that I want to get in place. And I want to hire some people. I want to start paying for some different like software services before I'm actually making revenue because I'm laying out a plan associated with the fact that I know that I'm going to make revenue or hopefully speed up that process. How do you look at that when you're implementing profit first? Because you know you're going negative, but for me, anytime we over invested on purpose, it was hard to like keep track of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what? I don't know that I've been in the profit first camp long enough to give a really great answer to that question. So here's what when you ask that question, because I've thought about this as well. It's like if I'm going to stick my own money in my business, what's that going to look like? And I would say that what we would want to do in that case is, of course, very much control our expenses,
Yeah.
right? And then as soon as revenue starts coming in, we want to build in those allocations. We want to have set target rates for, again, what is the owner's pay, what is the profit, what is the tax account, and what is the operating expenses, and have those built in. And now it might be that the operating expenses right off the bat are 90% of what the revenue that comes in, but you work with that and you come up with a goal of, for this quarter that's what it is, but by next quarter here's where we want to be, and the next quarter here's where we want to be, and you drive the business going forward always with an idea of those taps, those target allocation percentages.
Yeah.
Right, so we build those for each business, and the main frame is either we do it over the course of 6 quarters or we do it over the course of 8 quarters. So you can see I'm not walking into a business and cutting everything and blowing it up. It's let's look at what you're doing. Let's find out how the business is actually flowing, all of the flow of money in and out of the business, and then let's build a plan to get it to that target allocation that we want to get to.
Yeah, that's dope. Um, let's break that down real quick. The target allocation percentage, target
Yep.
allocation percentage. What's the S stand for again?
I think it's percentages.
Okay. Yeah. Taps. It's a
Yeah.
small S. Okay, so the target allocation percentages. Um, I wanted to bring that up real quick because those are associated with the bank accounts that you set up in Profit First, with something that is also counterintuitive or just not normal for what people are used to when it comes to setting up bank accounts. I remember when I set up Profit First for my last business, and I went to the bank and asked them to set up, or my partner went to the bank and asked them to set up like 8 different bank accounts. They like had no idea what he was talking about. So could you just talk about that real quick?
Yeah, that's the norm. The banking industry has no idea what you're talking about, and it's okay. So I had the same. I work with a credit union again, and I'll just sidetrack here. I work with a credit union. Why? Because my values dictate that I want to put money in a place where my community is served, not just a big bank.
Yeah.
So I sought out a credit union that could do the work that I needed done for my business. And even though it's still the banking world, it feels a little closer to home, and it lines up more with my values than working with a big bank does. And so I just went to the credit union and said, hey, I need free accounts set up that aren't checking accounts. I don't need them to be checking. I just need them to be savings types accounts. And I need another 5 of them set up. And I was really surprised because I had already worked with this credit union before I went there. They said, yeah, it's no problem. They didn't even ask me why. And in the credit union I use, I can actually rename them. So they're all named exactly as they need to be named. And I have the target allocation percentage right there, so that when I go in to do my banking, and here's another thing, I now only do my banking on the 11th and the 26th of the month.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, the money that shows up is then allocated out at that point in time. I don't go into my banking every single day. I don't check it every day. I just run my business, and I go in on those days and allocate out.
Yeah.
And so those targets, the banks will have a challenge in some cases with you setting up. And really, you know what? The bank is there to serve you.
Yeah.
If they're not going to work with you, change banks.
Yeah.
Like, it's pretty simple. Like, if they're not going to, if they don't like, as my dad used to say, if you don't like my fence post, don't swing on my gate. That's,
Never heard that one.
I know that's like old. That's like really. Yeah, if the bank isn't going to work with you, just change banks. Don't be attached. Give that up.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. Like, it's so hard. It's funny that it's so hard, even when all of your banking is pretty much done online, that it's so hard to even set up different accounts and like relabel them for what you want them to be called. Some banks are better at that, but I mean, even that, like setting up an opening account and closing an account just to put money in different places, it seems like it should be easier. And I think some banks are getting better at that. And there's probably some online banks and some credit unions, obviously, apparently, that seem very friendly when it comes to setting that up for you. But yeah, definitely, I advise everybody to read this book for sure and check out what we're talking about a little bit more in depth. Could you talk about maybe within your own experience as well, and with some of the people that you've worked with so far, with implementing Profit First, like what type of expenses people have given up, and maybe some of the ones that have been hard to give up? Because I can think about a lot of stuff that I used to invest in with my business, and maybe even some stuff that I'm investing in now with my new projects that are like, they're like little dopamine hits associated with like things that I think are cool, but maybe aren't necessary. So maybe just define that a little more.
Yeah, I think stuff like I can give you an example. So, like for me, for example, I was spending almost $3,000 a month on an office.
Yeah.
Right. I've now taken that down to $250. Like that's a massive savings.
What are you spending $250 on if you have a home office?
So I have what I have is a virtual office because I have a location in another, like I live on an island and then I have a location in the main city. I have a virtual office where all my mail shows up. My phone flows through there. And when I go to Vancouver to have meetings, they have boardrooms that I can rent out and pay extra for to have those meetings. So it's the same place where I used to have my office. I just have taken it down to where I don't have a physical space there anymore.
Cool.
Right. Yeah. So there's been things like that. There's been stuff like people looking at it and going, the coach I'm working with, I'm really not getting any value from. And it's actually a friendly relationship, much more than a coaching relationship. I've actually seen that go away. And I'm an advocate of having a coach, but if I'm going to have a coach, I want that coach to be pushing my buttons.
Yeah.
I don't want a friendly relationship. I don't want somebody I can manipulate and maneuver to do the things that I want. I want somebody that's going to hold me accountable. And I'll give you an example of that. When I was taking drum lessons when I was about 20 years old, and I was the snot-nosed, arrogant rock and roll, demigod that I thought I was back then, I went and took lessons from this old timer. And he was like an old jazz musician. And I'd go do the lesson. He'd show me stuff. I'd have to practice. I'd go back a week later and I hadn't practiced. Right. And this went on for about 4 weeks. And then finally I showed up and I sat down. He's like, all right, let's work on this stuff. And I hadn't practiced it. And he freaks out on me. He's just like, what the fuck are you doing here? He just starts calling me out. And he's like, don't waste my time. Like, I don't give a shit about your drumming career. I really don't. If you want to be here and you want to learn from me, I'm all in. If you're not going to do the work, don't show up again.
Yeah.
And I didn't show up again. The guy freaked me out, right? But I learned in that moment, like, wow, that was on me. That was totally on me. That if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to spend the money on this, then I better be all in invested, and they better be all in invested as well.
Yeah.
Right. So I've seen that get cut. I've seen people cut phone lines. I've seen people cut cable. I've just seen things where they had cable in their office for no reason other than it was a convenience. And it's like, do you really need that? So it's been stuff that when they look at it, it's like, I don't, this isn't adding value to the end game for my client experience or for my customers. And it's really not making my life any easier in terms of running my business.
Yeah.
The other thing I've had people do is, and I learned this from Tim Ferriss, actually, when I started my podcast, what I heard when I listened to Tim about starting his podcast. And one of the things he said was he edited his first 30 shows so that he would know how it's done. He would know how long it would take. He would know what that cost should look like in terms of hiring somebody to edit it, but also so he could learn how he sounded, how his questioning went, like all of that experience. He was able to take that data in, and it made him a better host, and it gave him a really great experience. So I did that as well when I started my own show, as I went about learning how to do every aspect of it. And now I farm that stuff out. Now I don't take care of all of that stuff.
Do you use it's a relevant question for my audience as well, because a lot of people actually have podcasting editing services that they charge monthly for. Do you do you use a service that does all of it for you, or do you split those up to different contractors? How do you do that?
Yeah, so I have I have this amazing producer named Leslie Deschutter, who is my wife, who takes all of that on. But I'll tell you what I did is I did a show that forced me to go live, and there's no editing when you're live. Like when you go live, there is no opportunity to edit. And so now I run the show pretty much with the idea that other than adding a break and a beginning and an end, because the beginning and the end are canned, there is no editing to be done. The show is the show, and it's my job and my goal to treat it like it's a live event, and it's not going to be cut or edited or hacked in any way. It's like, this is what it was, and just put it out there. But that's my own idea of how I want to do it.
What's the name of the podcast that you have running right now, just so the audience can look it up?
Yeah, it's the Bloom Living Podcast, and Bloom Living is all one word. That's sort of my state of mind, is Bloom Living. I want everybody on the planet to be living in a state of Bloom Living, where our lives are blooming and we're living a powerful, meaningful life.
Yeah, I love how the name of your business really is aligned with your philosophy and your values, which we keep coming back to, which I think is really cool. Your website as well is bloomstrategies.com, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Talking about the Bloom Living podcast for a second, are there any episodes on there that are relevant to talking about like profit first or business or different things that people can dig into? I'm sure the audience can kind of scroll through as well, but maybe some.
Yeah, you know what? Season 3, which we just launched, is all going to be about money. So
Nice.
this, in the past, I've made the Bloom Living podcast more about bringing in entrepreneurs, bringing in people that, there's a couple on there. Isabel Mercier Turcot, who has a TED talk that's over 2.5 million views now. I think she's worked with many business owners. There's a couple episodes with her that are just brilliant. She's a brilliant business mind. There's a gentleman named Dr. Suki Muker who is 8-time Ironman competitor and runs a very successful business in one of the wealthiest postal codes in Canada, and his brain is just brilliant. Like a lot of what I found in the first 2 seasons of the show, working like talking to people that was all about a lot more about mindset, was how much mindset drives everything.
Yeah.
Like and I've gotten that from you as well, Tommy. Everything I see that you do and you put out in the conversations we've had is really about what's going on in the coconut, right? Like if it's not clear up here and if it's not dialed in up here, it's not going to really uh, manifest out into the world, if you will. Like I have it like it's mind, idea, expression. So when we are clear up here and we've got ourselves dialed in and in tune with who we are and what we're up to, then we're open to ideas coming in. And I don't know where these ideas come from that I get to do things or start things. They just come in.
Yeah.
And then it's about expression. Like how am I going to take that into action? How am I going to move that forward if it really lights me up? And so I find so much of that with everything we do is the mind, idea, expression. It's how am I open to new things, new possibilities, new ways of doing stuff, and moving forward into that. And you can take that into any game: the game of building a business, the game of collecting a lot of money, the game of having great relationships, the game of building a family. Whatever game you want to play on the planet, you can take that thought process into it.
Yeah. And it's cool to see that actually translate into tangible results, especially with a business like business like you have, where you're talking directly about finances. I mean, this is like something that translates directly into monetary gain for a lot of people. And I think it's something that's not talked about enough because it's sort of a subtle thing and it sounds sort of cliche, but I really believe that energy is everything. And if you unlock that and you're aligned, then all of these things can flow out of you a lot more easily. And especially when you check in with your values and you understand what those are, understanding what those are takes a lot of self excavation. I'm sure it's been a big process for you as well. But when you do understand what those are, then it's a lot easier to make decisions. You have a mental framework, sort of like profit first for your life in your mind in terms of what you do and don't accept and just what you act. And that output just turns into what it ends up being. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up because that's obviously something that I'm really passionate about as well, and something that I think is really, really, really important to get right starting out. Awesome, man. I want to talk a little bit about, because you're a profit first professional. There's tons of people who need what you do. This is still a relatively new thing in the way that it's being presented, which I think is really cool because I also think it's a bit more accessible than some of the financial help in the past for people, even smaller business owners, because you're kind of like hiring a coach to help you do this versus shelling out huge sums of money to a financial planner or something that might not have your best interests at heart. So can you just talk a little bit about how people get started with Profit First, and in particular how they could find you?
Yeah. So, I mean, they can read the book. Like, yeah, I get paid to go into businesses and implement Profit First, but really reading the book is a great place to start. And, bootstrapping a business is a lot of stuff you can do on your own. But if you don't have the mindset to deal with the numbers, if you don't really want to take the time to restructure and you want the coaching, which is where I'm going to hold somebody accountable a lot more. I'm going to be setting up meetings on an ongoing basis. So, my typical clients, we engage for 1 year and we start that process of building out the next 4 quarters and having quarterly meetings going over the actual numbers that they've entered into their financial accounting system. and looking at it and talking about it and working on it and finding out what can we improve, what didn't work, what did work, where did the trouble come up. And all of my clients, when they first jump in, those first times that they do the allocation, they have a ton of questions. Like, am I doing this right? Did I do the real revenue correctly? Did I understand this right? Like, that's where having me work with them is a huge benefit. And you can just get a hold of me at bloom@bloomstrategies.com is the simplest way to send an email if you wanted to ever get a hold of me. And I wanted to back up just a little bit on the allocation accounts. One of the things that we do at Profit First is because sometimes we get the temptation to dig into accounts that have money in them, is we actually set up the profit and the tax account at another institution where it's out of sight, out of mind. And when we do our allocations for that, we send that money off, and now it doesn't exist. It's not something you can decide and talk yourself into spending more money on something because you have. That's right. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. You don't have it. It's not something that you can take into account to just suddenly use because you have this great idea that you think would help the business, right? And not everybody needs that, but a lot of people do need that. Like, you need some strict guidelines put in place to really get you to trust yourself and trust the process, right?
Yeah. Yeah, those are some really good points. And like psychologically, as a human being, it's difficult to keep yourself from doing some of that stuff. I mean, I can relate to seeing that money there and spending it on something that I thought was a good idea at the time, and then having regret for having acted on that impulse. So I think personally that having a profit first coach, in addition to understanding the profit first approach, is something really important to keep yourself accountable. And I will be implementing that into my next venture, so I can vouch. But yeah, it's awesome. Like, just profit first in general, values, everything. Thomas, I really, really appreciate you coming on, man. It's been a blast. Like, any parting words of wisdom or anything that I left out that we didn't cover yet, that you want to say to the audience?
I think the only, the lesson at this point, I'm 54 years of age. I've done a lot of crazy, wonderful things in my life and had a great time doing it. I would say that if I were to impart any words on somebody, is live your dream. Like, don't let anybody tell you that you can't be who you think you are, and hang out with people that see you in that light. And I'll give you an example. I have this group called Being Man. And we started off as just one group of 7. We now have, I think, 8 groups around the world that are teams of 5 to 7 men. And my group in particular, we meet every week on Tuesday night on a Zoom call. We support each other. We are vulnerable with each other. And in every crazy idea that I have, that I say, I'm going to go do this, they see me as that already. They allow me the space and the freedom to be who I truly am. And it gives me confidence to step out at a greater level than I know myself to be. And not everybody needs that, but I know that I really enjoy having that support. So I think it was Jim Rohn who said, you are, the culmination of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I truly believe that. If people you're hanging out with aren't on your fan club, aren't part of your fan club and holding you up in the highest light and seeing you for all the greatness that you are, you might want to check some new people in that are going to be there with you, and you give that to others. And when you have that kind of relationship with people, you can do anything in this world that you didn't think you could. And so I guess that would be my parting words, is really be cognizant of who you're with, who you hang out with, who you spend time with, and the kind of thoughts and feelings that you allow to manifest, because that's what shows up in your world.
Yeah, that's ultimately what dictates everything. And I'm like really, really glad that you brought that up as a final piece of advice as well. Because it's something that a lot of people take for granted. Until you shift your world and have those type of people around you, you don't necessarily know what that feels like. I know I grew up in a situation with a lot of toxic masculinity going on, where I would just get it was like playful to call each other names but shoot each other down. I mean, I realized at one point, when I had like big ideas, they were just getting shot down and kind of like belittled. And at some point, I was able to break out of that. And yeah, now I'm around people where when I share stuff, it gets encouraged, and then I actually put it in place, which has really changed my life and obviously changed yours, man. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Um, Thomas, it's been amazing. I'm going to go ahead and include all your information in the show notes. Today, we talked about values, profit first, the 5 people that you hang around with that sort of create your reality, which is awesome. I would love to have you back on at some point, man. I will make sure that we include all the information below so people can find you. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, brother. And I love your name.
My name in general. Yeah, it's a good one.
Although I used to be Tom, which I didn't like because I played drums and I was surrounded by Toms. So I was like, I needed to differentiate myself. So I chose, my parents named me Thomas. So I went with Thomas, but I love Tommy.
Yeah, well,
It's a great name, man.
yeah, it is, and I'm happy that we sort of have that in common. So
Yeah. Hey man, it's been great for me. Thank you so much for just including me in your world, and I love the stuff that you share on your Facebook page, and the people, even the people that you have on your page. I don't know hardly any of them. I might know one or two, and even their stuff that they share is really great stuff. It's right in my camp of thinking, which is why I love it. So keep it up, man.
yeah, absolutely, man. Well, we connected for a reason, dude. So I will talk to you soon, and thanks again for coming on, bro.
All right, cheers.